Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Grand Rounds for the Department of Medicine. I'm John Hickman. It is my distinct pleasure, as always, to have you here. I am very excited about today's talk. On behalf of our chair, Dr. Frazier, Drs. Tosco, Spencer, and myself, thank you for joining us. I wanted to thank especially the Healthcare Innovation Lab, who are sponsoring today's talk, and it's my pleasure also to tell you a little bit more about the lab. We have some financial disclosures listed here for our speaker, nothing that will impede our talk today. The Healthcare Innovation Lab is a very special collaboration between BJC and WashU across multiple disciplines and across multiple different individuals, including clinician scientists, data analysts, program managers, administrators, and the like. And like I said, not just across the Department of Medicine, also across surgery, OB, pediatrics, anywhere that we deliver care, and hopes to improve the care that we deliver through technology and innovation. There's a number of areas that they focus on, including predictive analytics, looking at sepsis, postoperative outcomes, hypoglycemia, and who will develop it, from all the way to remote patient monitoring. It's a pleasure for them to join us today to help bring us this lecture, and our amazing speaker, one of the titans of American medicine, about whom, again, you'll hear more in a moment. We will have a chance, hopefully, for questions at the end, so please, everyone online, go ahead and send them through the Q&A or chat function. I will help moderate them with our speaker. And here to introduce our speaker, it's my pleasure to welcome our own titan of American medicine, Dr. Mark Williams, our new chief in the Division of Hospital Medicine. Dr. Williams, thank you.
Thank you. Well, this truly is an honor, and I've heard lots of words to describe Bob Wachter that are incredibly flattering, and I think Titan is an appropriate term to describe him. And I've had the good fortune, actually, I think, to become a friend of his. He actually had breakfast with me early one morning, where I literally climbed the hill up to his neighborhood as I was about to go leave the country for my first international hospital medicine visit. And he gave me great guidance as always. And I got to meet him early in his career somewhat, when he wasn't famous, as I like to think about it, because I don't know that he would have talked to me at that point in time as we bumped into each other at this meeting. But it got me involved in hospital medicine. But even going back to when he didn't know me, my career was at a bit of a crossroads in the mid-90s. And then this New England Journal of Medicine issue came out in 1996, and I looked at it and saw this word hospitalist, and I was like, what is this? And I read it and I was like, that's what I want to do. And I convinced Grady Memorial Hospital to give us quite a bit of money to start a hospitalist program, and then I've been following that path ever since. And just to give you some idea of how famous he is, he actually does gigs in Las Vegas, and he is an amazing, accomplished pianist. And so, you know, I can do the usual. He has over 300 publications and grants and books and so forth. But this is just how impressive he is. It isn't a remarkable individual who's truly influenced healthcare in America. He does a little singing on the side. So I'm going to hand this over to him, and I'm really looking forward to learning from him again, as I always do. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Please, I'm glad. Let's get rid of that picture as quickly as possible. When I was preparing for that, I ordered a costume out of costumes.com, and it arrived, and it was clearly sized for a thin 12-year-old going out for Halloween trick-or-treating. And as I tried it on and was practicing for that performance, my wife kept walking by and saying, "Are you really sure you want to do this?" And I think what she had in mind was that someone would take a picture and show it going around somewhere. So it's great to be here, and really congratulations on recruiting Mark, who is really one of the great leaders in the field of hospital medicine. And I know we'll take the program to even greater heights. It's been a joy being here for the last couple of days. I have to say the visiting professor thing, which I used to do a lot of, is now kind of new again. And it brings to mind something my younger son told me not too long ago. He's autistic and kind of socially awkward. And during one of the lulls in the pandemic, he said, "Dad, can I go out and see a friend of mine is playing guitar at a local pub?" And I said, "Sure, sweetie." So I took him there. And I picked him up afterwards, and he was beaming his smile from ear to ear. And I said, "Benj, how'd it go?" He said, "It's great, Dad. Nobody knows how to socialize anymore." And so I sort of feel a little bit of that way as we kind of get back out there and meet people and talk. But I also have, it brings to mind how wonderful it is to meet people at a spectacular place like this and see the kinds of things you're doing and the struggles that you have and all the, the issues with burnout and dealing with COVID and life in 2022. I think people tend to think they're very local and idiosyncratic, but they tend to be quite general. We're all experiencing versions of the same thing. So let me go ahead and get started. So my talk today is on the digital revolution, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the history of digitization in healthcare. Let me see if I can advance this guy. Yeah. The sort of painfully slow digital transformation of medicine. I'm going to talk about a few tech innovations that were accelerated by COVID, particularly telemedicine and dashboards. And then spend a minute on AI. I spoke yesterday to the innovation folks on AI, so won't dwell on it, but actually that's something that I thought might hit its tipping point during COVID and really didn't, I think quite interestingly. I'm going to talk about why I believe this is the now post-electronic health record era. You might say, do we just spent a few $100 million putting in that electronic health record? Are you saying we're going to ditch it? And the answer is no, but it's really the foundation of what you will be doing over the next 10 years. So we're entering a new, more complex and more nuanced part of the digital transformation. And then talk a little bit about the future and talk about why I'm enthusiastic about it. Why I wrote a book about healthcare's digital transformation about 6 or 7 years ago. And I wrote it largely because I was disappointed and a little bit grumpy about how bumpy it was. And I'll tell you a couple of stories about why. But I think we're entering an era where I'm much more optimistic about what it's going to do for us and for, more importantly, for our patients. So that's kind of the subtext here. Let's start, and those of you saw my talk with the innovation group yesterday, probably the first 10 or 15 minutes will be fairly similar, and then we'll veer into different territory. I just want to sort of highlight this moment in American healthcare. And it's easy to forget this, but in 2008, fewer than 1 in 10 American hospitals had an electronic health record. So if you think about medicine, the most information intensive industry I can think of, in 2008, only 14 years ago, the way we stored and moved information around was on pieces of paper stored in 3-ring binders. We periodically used Post-it notes to just make it particularly challenging. We were the biggest purchasers of fax machines. That's sort of how we moved information around. And about 5-7 years later, fewer than 1 in 10 American hospitals did not have an electronic health record. So if you think of the EHR as sort of the core, sort of foundational piece of digitization in hospitals, and I could show you the same curve for doctors' offices, it's really fair to say that 15 years ago, we were almost in a completely analog industry. And by 5-ish years ago, we were almost completely a digital industry. Now, it doesn't mean if I walked up on the wards, I wouldn't see a lot of paper. I'm sure I would. But it is to say that the core way we store and move information around, move from analog to digital. And that is a very big deal just in terms of how did this happen and what that curve represented. You can't look at a curve like this and not see a COVID surge these days. So this is EHR adoption. And this was the federal government sprinkled $30 billion on us as part of the rescue plan for the recession in 2008 to basically incentivize hospitals and doctors to implement electronic health records. They had been doing it quite sluggishly, as you see, and it worked. It got us all to put in electronic health records. And over the last 10 or 15 years, pretty much every major academic system that I know of has gone to Epic. Epic has sort of become the one that you use if you're a big, complicated academic medical system. So big deal. So this was me now 7 or 8, 9 years ago when we put in Epic in 10 years ago, 2012 at UCSF. I was, I'm a computer fan. I wouldn't say I'm totally digitally native. I don't code, but I use computers for everything like everybody else, and I'm at least as modern as the usual 60-ish-year-old person. And I love open table, and I do all my banking online, all that kind of stuff. So I kind of had this feeling like it's not that hard. Digital transformation and the way I buy things was pretty straightforward. What could go wrong with healthcare's digitization? And as I said, I spent a year of my life, about 2014, researching and ultimately writing a book about what had gone wrong. It just struck me that this had gone it was far more difficult, far bumpier than I had anticipated, a lot of unanticipated consequences. And I think there are lessons there in what we've experienced in the last 10 years that we really need to learn as we go forward for the next 10 years. So let me spend a couple of minutes giving you the cliff notes of a 300-page book on kind of some of the things that surprising but went wrong. This is one that I always find amazing and quite true. This 7-year-old girl went to visit her pediatrician several years ago, and she was something of an artist, so she drew this drawing of her recollection of the visit to the doctor, and it's beautiful and charming and kind of terrifying, because you see there in the middle of the picture the girl and her mom next to her and her sister in the corner, and there in the far corner typing away back to the patient is the doctor. And I think this probably looks familiar to all of us. The computers have turned us into to data entry clerks. And there's only one piece of the picture that's wrong. I think it's actually quite an accurate picture. And I don't know if you can catch it, but it's a smile on the doctor's face, which is, I've never seen a doctor who is happy of this in this state of affairs, that I am spending an enormous part of my day entering data into this machine. And part of what makes physicians so unhappy, and nurses too, by the way, is that I could bear it if I felt like I was getting useful information out of the machine, but it feels like I'm just entering information and there's very little useful stuff coming back at me in the form of intelligence or analytics or anything to help me do my job better. It feels like kind of a one-way street. So that I think most of us were surprised. At UCSF, we now, about 100 of our busiest clinicians, ambulatory clinicians, are now using scribes, which the health system is mostly providing, because we've seen levels of unhappiness among ambulatory physicians that are kind of off the charts, and most of it is about this. And I'm kind of proud I'm the person who brought scribes to national attention, because it was maybe 5-ish years ago, I saw the scribe thing begin to take off as a cure for this, basically because clinicians were spending so much time documenting that scribes were being hired all over the place to help ease that burden. And my wife is a journalist who mostly writes for the New York Times. And I came home one day and I said, honey, do you know in every industry they digitize and they immediately start laying people off? Only in healthcare could we figure out a way of digitizing, and we now have to add another person to the room in order to do the clinical encounter. So she thought that was interesting and wrote kind of the first big paper in the Times on the emergence of scribes. So I see scribes as a symptom of digital entered our life. We thought it would make our lives easier, because it does in most of the rest of our lives. And in this way, at least, it made it harder and more burdensome in a way that surprised us. Just one other sort of reflection on how challenging this has been in ways that surprised me, at least. This is an ad I found in 2015 for an emergency medicine job in Arizona. And it starts, Arizona General Hospital is coming to the state. It's in a Phoenix suburb. It's a little tiny boutique general hospital, which sounds nice. I worked part of the time at San Francisco General Hospital, which is decidedly not a boutique general hospital, but this one is. And here's what they put in the ad. Remember, they're looking for an emergency medicine doctor, so it's nice if they have an ER. They have a radiology suite. They have a little tiny place, 2 ORs, outpatient surgery, 16 inpatient rooms. But there was only one part of the ad that they put in bold. Clearly, they thought it was their main selling point to try to hire this emergency medicine doctor. It was that we have no electronic medical record. This is you should come here because you can scribble on pieces of paper. It was very clear there that things had gone badly, kind of off the rails, in a way that surprised virtually everyone, particularly as you think about the amount of hype as we were thinking about digitization. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to prevent all kinds of medical errors. It'll make things more efficient. It'll be satisfying the doctors and nurses and patients. And clearly something different had happened. And by the way, I should say I am not a Luddite. People periodically read my book and say, you're right, we should get rid of the computers and bring back the paper. Those people are crazy. It's not the right call, not the right thing to do. But I think what I want to do is sort of think as deeply as we can about what went wrong and what are the lessons about this transformation that are useful as we do additional digital transformation, which is where we are today. So here are the lessons and why I'm less grumpy about digital health than I used to be. Not that it's that much better than it was, but I now can see the path to something that will actually be far better for all of us. Not an easy path, but one that I think is pretty clear. Let me start with one of the key lessons is that the implementation of digital technology in every industry goes through a series of stages that are relatively, in retrospect, predictable and and don't have that much overlap. A little bit. It's not like you have to do one and be done with one and then have to do two and be done with two, but you'll see that they're relatively discrete. And part of what was an epiphany for me is one of the things that was why healthcare IT was difficult is this is a long journey, and we were only at an early part of the stages that we have to ultimately go through. So here they are. The first is what I've already talked about. The first is we had to digitize the way we collect and store and move information around in straightforward ways. And that basically was the electronic health record. That was the vehicle by which we digitized the record. That's the foundational piece. The second piece is known in the lingo as interoperability. It is the connectedness of all of the digital pieces, because inevitably there's going to be some piece where you store certain kinds of information, but then there's the radiology piece, and there's the piece of the electrocardiograms. And then there is the, okay, we've got Epic, but we're getting a transfer of a patient who's coming from a place that's got Cerner. And then the more complex, and I think ultimately more important part is I'm a new company that has developed some really cool tool to take care of people with diabetes better. How does that piece bolt into your core Epic infrastructure? This is something we're all very familiar. If you have an iPhone or I guess Androids have the equivalent of an app store, something where you have a new application, but they have been so thoughtful about the standards that it really pretty much bolts into it without any friction, and you're using it, but it feels like you're still just using your iPhone in a normal way. So that idea of interoperability is a really important piece and something that doesn't just happen out of the box. And actually there are reasons why, from a business standpoint, the company that builds, for example, Epic, is not particularly enthusiastic often about creating an environment where all sorts of other apps can easily and in a frictionless way bolt in, because there's a decent chance Epic is building a version of that thing and they want you to buy that rather than a third-party tool. So second piece is really having this this digital ecosystem connect with each other in a way that's pretty seamless. The third gets even harder. All right, we've got all this digital information sloshing around through our digital tubes. All the pieces are connected. That's pretty cool. Now, what are we going to do with it? What are we gleaning new insights from this data that help us do our work differently? And then the fourth is the hardest, which is, okay, it's one thing to have insights. It's another to now change the way we do things to make it better. So converting those insights into actions that improve value in healthcare shorthand for quality, safety, access, equity, good stuff divided by the cost, making it more efficient, or we're making it better or higher quality or more accessible or more satisfying for any of the involved parties. Those are the stages. If I had to grade us today, I'd say we'd largely have digitized the record. For the most part, we have not connected all of the parts. If you have Epic, one of the reasons you bought Epic is Epic systems connect reasonably well to other Epic systems. It's one of their selling points. They connect pretty poorly to Cerner. And if you buy some cool new third-party thing and try to bolt it in, you will find out from your IT department that is not frictionless or costless. So sort of plus minus there. My belief is, as systems, and as an industry, we've virtually done nothing in terms of gleaning meaningful insights from all this data we now have in our systems, and we've done virtually nothing to convert these insights into actions that make care better. That's partly why people are so disappointed. They feel like they're spending all this time with number one, just putting the data in, and they're getting so little useful intelligence out. As I mentioned yesterday, I'm very familiar with what industries look like. Part of the way I learned this was from talking to some of the world experts on digital transformation of other industries and what the path was for other industries that went through digital transformation. One of the nice parts for healthcare is we're pretty much last in this path. So you can look at financial services and travel and retail and pretty much every other industry, and you can see what this looks like because they did this 20 years ago. The only industry that's probably a little behind us, other than healthcare, is education. And so in academic healthcare systems, we're in this magical Venn diagram where we're both. We're the two industries that haven't done this bolted together into one behemoth. So as I mentioned to folks yesterday, my older son is an industry that has done all four of these stages. In fact, his job is number 3 and number 4. And we'll periodically get into it about whose work is more important. And he'll make the point quite credibly that his must be more important because his industry invests in doing all four of these things, where obviously healthcare doesn't care enough to have done that. His industry is called Major League Baseball. And this is him with his World Series trophy. He works with the Atlanta Braves. And what he does is number 3 and number 4. And when you talk about digitizing the record, I mean, every pitch is analyzed, has 30 or 40 data pieces about how fast the ball is spinning and the launch angle and the wind and the this and the that. And he can tell you with a couple of keystrokes that this guy can't hit a low and outside curveball on Tuesday nights when the wind is out of the southwest and the pitcher is over 6'2" and has a stutter. I mean, it's really unbelievable the data that he has, that he can tell you everything, which he's using all the time as he's trying to figure out how to counsel the pitchers to pitch against the team coming into town. If they can't find interactions where they have pitched against that player, they'll just find a pitcher that looks like the pitchers that they have and to see how they did against that pitcher, and then analyze that, present that to the pitchers, to the catchers. That's his job. And the Atlanta Braves and every other baseball team has seen it to be in their interest to have a whole bunch of Dougs sitting in the stadium every day, analyzing that data, making sense of it, and presenting it to frontline people to allow them to do their work better. And they've seen it as in their business interest to do that. When you think about the analog in our businesses, how many people do we have who are doing that, presenting data to leaders or clinicians to help them do their work better? And the answer is a very, very tiny cohort of people in a way that we still haven't organized very well. So one of the key lessons is this is something we have to do. If we're going to get to digital nirvana, you have to get through all 4 stages, and we're really have scratched the surface. Another epiphany I had in thinking hard about this and researching this is this concept from Eric Brynjolfsson, who wrote this paper in '93 when he was at MIT, he's now at Stanford. Brynjolfsson coined the term the productivity paradox of IT. And the productivity paradox I found really interesting. The paradox was every industry looks at technology, says it's going to be great, it's going to improve the way we manufacture, the way we deal with customers, the way we do everything. Huge amount of hype. It turns out you need that, or else the industry won't make the investment and go through all the trouble of the transformation. And then the IT comes in, and lo and behold, nothing happens. That's the paradox. The paradox is all of the promised benefits do not accrue, and people are sitting there scratching their heads for a year or 2 or 3, and usually 5 to 7, saying, what happened? We thought this was going to be great, and it seems like it's great. There's no reason it shouldn't be, but we're not seeing the promised advantages in productivity or quality. Captured really nicely by this quote from a Nobel Prize winning economist who said in 1986, obviously he wasn't talking about healthcare, but in other industries like financial services, you go to the Wall Street trading desk and there's computers everywhere. He said you can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So yes, we have a lot of computers, but it doesn't seem like we're getting the promised advantages. So that's depressing. The good news about the productivity paradox from work that Brynjolfsson and others did is that it always gets better, always resolves. The problem is it on average takes about 10 years to resolve. You might say, oh, that's great. We're at about year 10 of digitization in healthcare, but there's every reason to believe that healthcare will be far harder and take far longer. The complexity, I'll actually get to a few other reasons later, but the regulatory environment, a lot of reasons why healthcare is tougher. And so I'm guessing we have 20 years. I'm guessing we still have another 5 to 10 years before we see the promised advantages. Now, what are the keys to achieving the promised advantages? I liken it to a safe deposit box. The first is obvious. Obviously, if anybody who's gone on Epic and then gone back to, how they manage your finances and go to your Fidelity website, or very quickly says, oh, this is technology that looks like what I'm used to using 10 years ago and the rest of my life. So there's that. The technology needs to improve, and you were pretty late adopters in Epic, so you should say thank you to us, because a lot of the horribleness, we complained to Madison, Wisconsin, they made it a little bit better, and you're on version 92.7.3. It's certainly better than what we put in 5 years before you, and it will get better still over time. So the technology needs to get better. But that actually was not the key insight that Brynjolfsson and others had. The key insight was the main thing that had to change was what he called, quote, reimagining the work. And what reimagining the work means is that when you put in the technology, there is an inclination to just replicate the way you did this thing when you were on paper. Partly because humans aren't all that creative. If you're not Steve Jobs, it's very difficult for people to say, here's the technology, let us completely rethink the way we do this thing. Using technology as sort of our core, And that means we're going to do it totally differently. Humans don't do that well. This is well known in the technology industry. Henry Ford was reputed to have said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. They had no ability to sort of think about their world with cars until there were cars. And I think that's true of all technology. So if you go onto Epic and you look at the doctor's note, what does it look like? It looks like a piece of paper and it's stored under a tab. Why? Because that's what it looked like when it was on paper. Except now, of course, you can import in 42 pages of lab results and radiology results, making the note completely unreadable. So it's in some ways made it worse. So what would a note look like if you were developing a physician's note today, de novo, in a technology world? You'd probably, it would be, it would be Word like a document, but it would also have collaborative charting the way, we're used to with Google Docs, or you look at Wikipedia. It would have lots of audio and video. It would look like a Facebook feed or a Twitter page, or look very different than a bland piece of like a Word document, but that's what we tend to do. So I'll get back to this idea of reimagining the work, because I think it's actually quite important as we think about how we get to this better stage. Spend just 1 minute on COVID. COVID, all sort of cataclysms always accelerate innovation because they unlock organizations and get you to be able to do things that you couldn't do before. I can tell you in my organization, part of the reason I started tweeting about COVID was I found I didn't have much to do, because on the middle of March 2020, we basically went to a form of healthcare martial law. Basically, there were 4 people who were making every decision for the organization. And even though I was chair of the largest department, I found myself taking in information all day long, and I didn't have much to do because we weren't doing anything other than COVID. So a lot of acceleration. And I think that that's been influential in the digital path, and will move some things along. I think it was captured nicely by this quote from my friend John Halamka. John was at Harvard for a long time, got recruited to Mayo, and started work, as he said, on January 1st, 2020. And he said, I was handed the 2030 digital transformation plan. Do you know that in 2020, we finished the 2030 plan? COVID accelerated 10 years into 10 months. So I think we're going faster now than we would have been. I'll talk about a couple of the obvious areas, but I'd say one of the key areas is that for senior leaders who were not really comfortable with digitization, it demonstrated them quite vividly how much digital transformation could do for you in ways that otherwise would have taken a number of years for them to see. This is our curve of video visits. I'm sure you had the same curve. We went from 1%, 2% up to 55%, ultimately to 70% of video visits. Big deal. And I think in some ways sort of introduced all of us and patients to the idea of remote care, technologically facilitated remote care. So I think that was clearly an area that tipped. Now, telemedicine, how big a deal is that in terms of the transformation of medicine? I would say if all it is a different way of doing a visit, it's fine. I think patients often prefer it. Sometimes clinicians prefer it. I don't think it's a game changer. If all it is instead of this 15-minute visit being in my office, it's a 15-minute visit telemedicine, it's something. I'd say probably the biggest deal is that it opens up non-geographically determined care options. So, if you were Mayo 25 years ago and you said, we want to be national and we want to have a presence in Arizona and Florida, you immediately said, all right, we're going to build a building and build a hospital. Today, I'm not sure you'd say that. You'd probably say we need to think about our digital strategy. In fact, that is what they're doing. And so it sort of ends the geographic imperative that all care is delivered in a physical space that we own, where we put our people, and allows a different kind of competition in the healthcare environment, which could be good or bad for you, depending on sort of how you play this. So that's probably, I think, the biggest deal, but I don't think it's not truly game-changing. What might be game-changing is telemedicine being a foundational piece of virtual care, meaning one of the components of a broad set of changes in the way we think about care that moves care to the patient's home or workplace and no longer is episodic. No longer is you come and see me every 2 months, every 3 months, but essentially you're getting care and you're feeding us data continuously or semi-continuously. And you can see how this could facilitate it. If patients used to come in our office, and that's when we check their blood pressure and their weight and their glucose, and they're not even coming to their office. Now we have to get that data from their digital scale and their digital glucometer. And now why would I want that once every 3 months when they come in? If they're checking their weight every day, I want that every day. The challenge, of course, is if that information is flowing to us semi-continuously. There's no organization that I know of in healthcare that is ready to accept that data. And so this is a problem that we're now beginning to grapple with. So here's what it looks like. The patient has, in this case, their smartwatch. It's monitoring their heart rate and their EKG. And let's say you turn on the switch and that data is flowing seamlessly into the healthcare system. I've had friends of mine who are more digital optimists than I are periodically will say, how great is that going to be that the primary care doctor is getting all this information on all of their 1,500 patients? That's not a world I'm familiar with. The 300 primary care doctors that work in my department would quit by 5 o'clock this afternoon if I told them this was going to happen. So what you're going to need is something that we sometimes call care traffic controllers, a new middle layer of the healthcare system that is basically looking at this population of people who have digital stuff being monitored continuously or semi-continuously, only to grow, not just from their watch, not just from their glucometer, but ultimately from their Alexa, from their toilet seat, from who knows. And here's what it might look like. Patient 112's sugar is high, the algorithm bumped the insulin, but let's get a coach involved. Patient 42 has an irregular heart rate and is short of breath, let's do a televisit. Patient 13's weight is up and the oxygen saturation is worse, I'll lock the salt shaker in the refrigerator. That's sort of the next phase when we go to the Internet of Things and your entire house is wired. So we're not ready for this. I'm pretty sure you're not ready for this, but as we move care to more digital, virtual, semi-continuous, I think it's naive to believe that we can just keep on doing it in these 15-minute Q 3-month aliquots and not rethink about, no, it's actually going to be more of a semi-continuous relationship with patients who are collecting data in real life, and we're going to have to figure out how to manage that. I don't think any of us have the foggiest idea. Now, here's one other unanticipated consequence. This is the curve of the inbox messages at UCSF over the last several years, and you see they have exploded. It has now become the #1 issue at our in my department. We're spending a huge amount of time and energy trying to deal with this. So these are my chart messages. These are patients who are on my chart. They have this patient portal. And here's what I think has happened. We enabled and often encouraged 24/7, 365 access to our patients, stimulated with lots of confusing new information and no or inadequate self-help tools, and didn't give a moment's thought to the workforce, workflow, and business models needed to support it. And lo and behold, we wake up one day and our clinicians are on their knees saying, I can't, not only am I spending all this time documenting each encounter, but at the end of a 9-hour day, I go home and I've got 100 inbox messages to deal with. Now, if we were smart like the lawyers, we would have figured out a way of charging people for every 6 minutes of our time. We didn't do that. We mostly have made it free, although we're trying to figure out a way of charging for some of them. For patients, it's probably even better than free, because if we brought them in for a visit, they might have to pay a copay. We've told them that this is this great portal you have, feel free to use it. We haven't figured out the algorithms to figure out, like, okay, the patient has a message. Does that go to the doctor? Does it go to some other person? We haven't built the self-help tools so they could schedule themselves a visit, do refills. There's just a ton of foundational work that we did not do before turning this switch on. And lo and behold, everyone is kind of on their knees dealing with this inbox issue. So it's just it's another bit of unanticipated consequences as we digitize, but really don't think deeply enough about how it changes the work. And of course, now with open notes, patients are now seeing what did the doctor mean when he or she said X, or I just got my cardiogram and says abnormal cardiogram, or what does it mean to have a low magnesium? I'm going to message the doctor. So that just is not workable, and that's the problem that we're dealing with today. Okay, dashboards. This is not particularly sexy, but I think actually quite important. Part of what made physicians and everybody, nurses and leaders, unhappy, so spending all this time putting information into the system, getting so little useful intelligence out. I think one of the things that did hit a tipping point during COVID was dashboards. This is our UCSF COVID dashboard. Luckily, this is from a month or so ago when cases were high. We're down to 6 cases in the hospital, none in the ICU today, and test positivity rate of about 2%. So much better than what you see here. But I hope you'll agree, you'll look at this, and I'm on this twice a day, and it's spectacular. I mean, it's up to the minute. All the data are flowing in real time. And I can look up in the upper right and see how many patients are in the hospital, in the ICU, on ventilators. if I hit jump to hospitalization category, which would divide the patients up to ones who are there for COVID versus they happen to have incidental COVID. If I hit vaccination status, it would divide those numbers up into who's gotten vaccinated or who hasn't gotten vaccinated. The bottom left is test positivity rates, not just everybody, but then divided up into those who came in with COVID symptoms versus asymptomatic people who came in for a heart attack and we test them routinely, or came in for colonoscopy. So an immense amount of data in real time, nicely visualized. This replaces what we used to do, which is, oh, I'm interested in data, I'll send you the spreadsheet, which is worthless. So this is the kind of stuff my son does for a living for the Braves. We've never had in healthcare. And I think COVID has gotten us used to, oh, you can take that data and present it to clinicians and to leaders in actionable form in a way that's nicely laid out and visualized, meets their needs. I think now that we've seen it, I think we're going to demand it, and we should for the rest of our business. AI, just spend 1 minute. Here's a partial list of startups in the AI space, lots and lots of hype. Seems like it's ready for prime time. All the data are beginning in digital form. It's transformed the way we do almost everything else, whether it's driverless cars or the way we do search. And yet I can't think of an AI tool that really sort of broke out during COVID. Maybe there's a couple of small things, but I think it's still in its hype cycle. So it will ultimately be a very big deal, maybe particularly with that care traffic control issue. Because if you think about how you're going to manage all this data that is being collected in real time and all these patients, you're going to have AI analyzing and trying to figure out who really needs care versus who's doing okay, which is a tricky problem. Okay, I want to spend the last bit of time talking about what has happened and what this new era is about. So as Mark knows, I've said many, many stupid things to people I've mentored over the years, maybe some to him. And but this is maybe the stupidest thing I ever said to a mentee. This is Russ Cucina, who's our chief digital health officer at UCSF. He's a hospitalist. I hired him, must have been 15 years ago after he finished his informatics fellowship. And I thought he was going to be in the middle of this sort of incredibly exciting phase of putting in this electronic health record and changing the way we did our work. And then I said to him, but what will you do after we've put the EHR in? I really could not. I thought maybe there'd be 2 or 3 years of cleanup work to do, and then he would be done and he'd have to sort of move on to a different line of work, which of course was ridiculous. So we are now entering what I see as the post-EHR era. We already have these EHRs. We're learning what they can do for us, but also learning their limitations. And let me just tell you about the business world and why the post-EHR era is being fueled by a tremendous amount of investment. And here is a curve of digital health funding by venture capital. And you see, even if you don't have to see the numbers, it has grown enormously over the last several years. As Silicon Valley has sort of woken up and said, healthcare is a $4 trillion industry that is mostly just become digitally based, but still does not use digital tools to do all the magic stuff that we've done to transform every industry you can think of. How you hail a cab when there were cabs, how you watch, how you look for entertainment, how you order things. Every other industry we've transformed. Healthcare is ready now because the data are digital. So a huge amount of investment. And in addition to all the venture capital, new company investment, all of the digital giants have jumped back in a big way, seeing a huge opportunity. And that's IBM Watson. This is Google pushing on this with Google Health several years ago, hiring David Feinberg, who'd been CEO at UCLA, then Geisinger. Microsoft, huge health effort. Apple, obviously, with the watch and other hardware. And probably the most interesting one was 4 years ago, Amazon, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway coming together to form something called Haven and hiring Atul Gawande, the famed Harvard surgeon and author, to be their CEO. I can tell you, I've met with all of these companies. They all say, we get how hard this is. We dabbled in it 15 years ago. We failed. We're in it for the long haul. We're fine. Turns out it's still hard. Haven's closed. Feinberg left Google a couple of years ago, went to Cerner. Cerner just got bought. So I'm not sure what David's doing now. Google is still in healthcare, but they no longer have a discrete unit called Google Health. It's kind of gotten dispersed throughout the organization. Lots of talk about Apple struggling to figure out what its play is in healthcare. Microsoft's doing okay. IBM Watson just got sold, really for parts. And here are a couple of quotes that I think capture the moment, at least for the giants. This is IBM CEO last year, said, healthcare is always going to be more subtle as well as more regulated for all the right reasons. And to me, that's a natural. It's a decision that may impact somebody's life or death. You have to be more careful. So in healthcare, it turns out maybe we're too optimistic, like duh. This was after, Watson beat Jeopardy champions and they came out and said, Dr. Watson, we're going to do it. And they just completely flunked. And this just last week from Greg Corrado, who runs Health AI for Google, said in the health space, I don't think technology companies should do anything like, quote, move fast and break things, which is the mantra in Silicon Valley. We really, really need to be careful and move at a pace that's comfortable for caregivers and folks that work in the community. So they're still recognizing this is hard. But I think that the cumulative effect of all of this investment, including for the digital giants, is going to make a big difference. And here's the way I see the world now. You think about who won the Derby to be your electronic health record vendor. Could have been Google, they tried. Could have been Microsoft, they tried. The system we had before we went to Epic was built by GE, terrible. So the big giants tried, all failed. The companies that won the Derby, Epic, Cerner largely, are companies that were built to do one thing, which is to build an electronic health record. Turns out this was so hard that this had to be the only thing your business did in order to get it semi-right. But if you think about the competencies that an Epic has, they had the competency to build a big software tool to collect data and move it around in pretty simple ways. They were not experts in consumer-facing tools. When Epic became a company, there was no such thing as a patient portal. User interfaces, communication tools, data visualization, data analytics, none of these were core competencies. In Epic, they're trying to do all of these things, but it's highly unlikely that they will build tools as well as a company that was built just to do one of these things. So I think that what's fueling the post-electronic health record era is the pressure we're feeling to do better. Labor shortages, it's no longer, you might say, oh, we can just fix that by hiring another doctor or another nurse, and then realize that a third of what they're doing it could be done by technology. If the technology was good, and you say, oh, whatever, we can afford it. Well, now maybe not only can you not afford it, but you're not able to find enough nurses. And so you have to replace some of the labor so that the nurses are doing things that they are uniquely qualified to do. Same thing for the doctors. Growing interoperability, which is improving, analytics advances, digital companies are maturing. And I think we're all seeing the obvious limitations of what electronic health records can do. Doesn't mean you're going to ditch yours. They remain foundational to everything else, but you're going to be layering in other pieces on top of it. And I just want to sort of end with a couple of observations of things we're doing at UCSF that have demonstrated to me that part of the issue is what Silicon Valley is doing and what these startups are doing, what venture capital is doing, what Google's doing. But for the WashUs of the world and UCSFs of the world, a lot of the issue is how are we reacting to this? How are we organizing ourselves to succeed in an era where we have to be great at digital transformation? If you're not, believe me, your competitors will be, and you'll be in trouble. And also, we want to be at the cutting edge of how we figure out how to deliver care. So I'm getting a couple examples from UCSF of changes in the org chart and reinventing the work that at least strike me as being meaningful as we move toward this next more complicated stage. The stage that we were at, which seemed complicated enough, which was basically you buy this one piece of software from a company and put it in. That was complicated, but it's nothing compared to you might need to buy 100 pieces of software and put them in and integrate them in ways that actually make our ability to do what we do better. So here's how we have organized ourselves at UCSF for the post-electronic health record era. And I think it has some relevance from my discussions with the innovation folks yesterday. I think it's some relevance to how you are beginning to think about this here. We have our, what I call traditional, if there is such a thing, digital arm, which we call sort of the medical informatics group, which is really the group who's focused on Epic and the related tools around Epic. And their job is to make those things run really well, do upgrades, make sure we don't get hacked and ransomware. We just have a new affiliation with a hospital in Marin, and they want us to put in our Epic, so their job is to do that. We're doing more patient portal stuff, their job is to do that. So sort of take this foundational piece of software and modernize it and use it to do what we do and solve core clinical and business problems. So typically, here's the budget to do a thing. It's a one-year project. Go ahead and do it. They are spectacular. I think one of the things we came to realize was if that group of people is responsible for you to do digital transformation, to tackle a different kind of problems that we don't have a solution. There's not going to be one piece of hardware or software to fix it. It can never work because their job is to sort of focus on Epic as a almost laser-like focus on this set of tools, relatively short time horizons. So we have another group, the Center for Digital Health Innovation, CDHI, that I think of as their digital solution shop now for the health system. Their job is to solve big, hairy problems that have a longer time horizon, that has no single or simple solution, and for which the solution will probably be a diverse set of tools. So and then obviously it's going to be has to be total integration. These two groups have to play unbelievably well together, because at the end of the day, if you buy some set of tools that helps you manage people with liver transplants better or diabetes better, and the patients or the clinicians have to go off to some separate place and use that tool, never going to work. It's got to be, you're on Epic, you're using Epic, and you're using something, you don't even know you've left Epic, but you have. You're using some new tool that we've layered into it and built in, so its use is pretty seamless. So their big project is called the Digital Patient Experience, DPE, and this is the mantra. Everybody sort of says things like this: the right patient, provider, time, modality. And this is about a 3 to 5 year project. Their charge is to improve the way we interact with patients. What does that mean? It's how we bill patients. It's how we communicate with them before their surgery, after their surgery. It is how we take information from their Apple Watch and their digital scale and deal with it. It is about 1,000 things. In order to do this, they had to start off and spend a huge amount of time with patients and in different clinics and different practices to see how it all worked, go to visit our partner sites, huge amount of foundational work to even begin thinking through this problem. And then as they look for solutions, it's, well, this part of it we can solve with something that Apple makes. This part of it we can solve with something that the startup has built that's really cool, and we vetted it, and we believe the company's still going to be in business in 3 years, and so on. This thing, actually, Epic's building something that's coming out next year that we're going to use that. This thing we have to build ourselves, and then weave it all together. There's no way that your core informatics group can do that. It's a whole different line of work. It's a budget that's a 3 to 5 year budget. It's a recognition that we don't know the right answer, that you're going to try some things that will fail. A whole different line of work. If you don't have an enterprise like this, I don't see how you get this done. And we learned that, kind of stumbled onto it, but I think it's actually going to be very, very important. Last thing I want to say is gets to this issue of reinventing the work. And the reinventing the work, the example I like is our inpatient glucose management service. So at 6 o'clock every day, sitting in his house, one of our main diabetologists, Rob Rushikoff, gets up in the morning and reviews data for every patient in the building. So we have about a smaller hospital than you, maybe 700 or 800 beds. Every patient who has type 1 diabetes, on an insulin pump, 2 or more high sugars, any 1 low sugar. Those are the criteria. One of the things computers can do is sift through 700 patients in a nanosecond and say, show me the 20 patients that meet one of these criteria, and set them up in a queue. So Rob now has this queue of 20 patients. He sits down and has his latte and opens up his computer. And here's what he looks like at his computer screen. And this is the computer screen. This doesn't come out of the box from Epic. We said to him, what would you need to look at one screen and figure out whether we're managing the diabetes correctly? He said, well, I need the glucose trend, obviously, insulin doses, oral hypoglycemic. Here are the electrolytes I need eyes and nose, I need a diet. Okay, we built that screen for him. Doesn't come from Epic. It's took 20 or 30 hours of programmer time. That's what we did. Rob then gets up in the morning and toggles through patient number 1. Oh, yeah, no, they're doing fine. I don't have anything to say. Patient number 2. Oh my God, I can't believe they're doing this, they're doing that. And he then writes a consult from the inpatient glucose management service that says you should raise the Lantus or change the diet or whatever. Now, I didn't invent this. I actually found out about it one day on rounds when I was talking to my resident, and I said, have we heard from the consulting services? And she said, oh yeah, cardiology dropped a note. ID saw the patient, but they haven't dropped a note yet. And I was about to walk away. Those are the only 2 consults we called. And we say, oh, and also we got Rushikoff. So this had become a verb. I said, Rushikoff, what does that mean? He says, oh, Dr. Rushikoff dropped a note about our diabetes management. I said, did we call Dr. Rushikoff? He said, no, it just shows up. I said, what is that? So I said, Rob, I need to take you out to lunch to explain this to me. So that's the system. He goes through 20 patients. He opines on 8 to 10 of them a day. And in a study that we published a few years ago, the proportion of hypoglycemic patients went down by about 40%. Hyperglycemic patients went down 40%. The house staff actually love it. You would think, is it going to be annoying to have Rushikoff looking over your shoulder? It's gotten a little bit gamified. I was on the wards a few weeks ago, and we had a patient with diabetes, and the resident said, I really don't, planning the insulin dose is like, I really don't want to get Rushikoff here. It's like now a badge of honor that you didn't get Rushikoff because he's looking over your shoulder. So how long does it take him? It takes him an hour to review these 20 patients. How long would it take him if we called an endocrine consult? It would take an hour for him to come see the patient, review the chart, write his note, and all that. Now, the problem is, and the reason that there are not many Rushikoffs, is this is not a billable encounter by and large. So we've got to pay Dr. Rushikoff to do this, but we believe that it's the right thing to do. And we're actually going through all of the disease states to try to figure out what else is like this, where you could take advantage of digital to say, here are conditions where we find a patient population high risk of a bad outcome. We have an expert who it would be great if he or she could weigh in cases and be sure we're doing the right thing, but doing it in the form of a full-on consult will not work. It just can't scale. So to me, it's a wonderful example of what I mean by reinventing the work. This didn't come out of the box from Epic. We had to sort of come up with the idea. You have to figure out the politics, the money, all that. You have to build the site. But really, it comes from what can you do when you have digital information you could not have done when you had information on paper charts. And Dr. Rushikoff can do this now sitting in his house in the morning in a way that you couldn't do previously. So in the time that it used to take him to do one endo consult, he improves the care of diabetes and also education about diabetes care for the entire patient population. He's doing basically care traffic controller work for the entire population of diabetic patients in our hospitals. So I think it's a nice example of reinventing the work. And the reason I like it is it's not about some fancy code. It's not about AI. Now, maybe in the future will be AI Rushikoff rather than person Rushikoff. But for now, it's a person sitting at a computer and basically allowing subspecialist level knowledge to help generalists like me manage patients better at scale. So let me end with this, several easy predictions and a hard one. Health IT will ultimately do what we hoped it would do, which is transform and disrupt health and healthcare. The new system will be less EHR based, but don't ditch your EHR. It will remain the foundation of it. It will be less institution focused, less geographically determined, more patient centric, and ultimately it will deliver higher value care, higher quality, less expensive, and more equitable care. The winners in this $4 trillion a year sweepstakes may be any of the four entities: existing healthcare organizations that thoughtfully embrace transformation, which includes reorganizing yourself to succeed at transformation and to succeed at reinventing the work, which takes a kind of a culture where the Rushikoffs of the world are told, come up with this idea and we'll support you. And maybe it'll fail because a lot of these things fail, but we're going to give it a try. You have to have a culture like that or they won't do it. Maybe the EHR vendors will continue to do well by innovating, and particularly if they figure out ways to open their architecture. Some of the digital giants may be okay, although I've been struck over the last 3 years how they failed yet again. It's harder for a big multi-purpose company for whom health is only one of the 50 things they do to retain the kind of focus that you need. I think a lot of the winners will come from startups that are healthcare specific digital companies that skillfully address important use cases. I think these are all easy predictions. These are all going to happen. I'd say with 100% certainty. I have no idea when. Could be, it's not a year, could be 5, could be 15. Probably won't be more than that. So that's the era that we find ourselves entering. So I'll end with this quote from either Yogi Berra said it or he should have said it, but it sort of reminds me of our digital journey. In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. In theory, digitizing healthcare to make it better and safer and cheaper is easy. In practice, it's incredibly hard, but I think we're starting to learn the lessons we need to learn in order to get this right. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to some questions.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure, and thank you so much for your talk. We absolutely would love to start with questions from folks that are present. I'd love to know if you'd like to start. Again, you wouldn't mind repeating the question for folks on the webinar. Great.
Bob, that was terrific.
Hi, Ken. How are you?
Great. Look forward to talking with you in a little bit. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for everything you've done all along.
Thank you.
I'd like to learn about a little more about your thoughts on telemedicine, particularly limitations. I remember my own personal journey when I first heard of it, I was quite skeptical and then became very enthusiastic about its potentials. But not everything is directly data-driven, such as a glucose level or pulse rate. What about those patients whom the physician truly needs to do a good physical examination? And then related to that, as we go to telemedicine, what do you believe this means in terms of the traditional qualities that we profess that we want in a doctor-patient relationship, the comforting and being there for support and advising,
Yeah.
the interpersonal action of it, which gives physicians satisfaction.
Sure, right. So Dr. Lerner asked a question about sort of where does telemedicine, I broaden it to more than just telemedicine as a different way of doing a visit, but the general idea of virtual care. What does that do to the physician-patient relationship? Are there times where it will be inappropriate because you really need a good physical exam? Will we lose skills as physicians? Will we lose something in the doctor-patient encounter, which has been so sacred to us and so valuable for patients? I think, maybe this will be your next book. I mean, these are the questions that we will face in the next generation. As you know better than anybody, the history of medicine is one of new technologies coming out with always greeted skeptically, including the stethoscope, always felt to be the end of medicine as we know it, and then ultimately embraced because they delivered better outcomes. Now, I was about to say at a lower cost. They usually don't. They usually add costs, which I think may be the ultimate question here and the ultimate determinant, which is that we might believe, and certainly as physicians, I think we were socialized to believe that this magical encounter that we have with a patient in our office, laying on hands, having this discussion, is incredibly valuable to patients and obviously a satisfier to clinicians. I think that will be put to an empirical set of tests to see whether it really is as valuable as we think it is. And if it is valuable, is it worth the cost? And I guess if I look at the history of encounters between credentialed experts and people in other walks of life, when was the last time you saw a travel agent? When was the last time you saw a bank teller? When was the last time you saw a financial counselor? Just had my taxes done. I still use a person, but we met over Zoom rather than in person. I sent the documents through email. So all of those things have been transformed into digitally based encounters using data. Now, as soon as you say that, I feel like an idiot because, like, really, is what a doctor does with a patient saying you might have cancer the same as having your taxes done, or obviously not. But that will be tested. What are the limitations on that? And will people be willing to pay what is almost certainly going to be an incremental cost for the kind of high-touch care that we're used to? And the answer may be that the basic level of care that's provided through the basic health insurance provides relatively little high-touch care, in, an analog to your flying coach. And if you want to really see, you in the office, it will cost more the same way that you can get your taxes done cheaply and reasonably well without talking to a person. But if you want in-person care, it's available and it's costly. So I think those are all the questions to be worked out. The physical exam part, I think that is, there aren't that many cases where it is the core of the issue. And, we found workarounds even for things like abdominal exams, but the cardiac exam, I think increasingly will be, the patient puts some device that they have at home on their chest and it's interpreted through AI rather than through a human being. So it's going to be a very interesting phase, but I think you're asking the core question, which is what does it mean to the essence of medicine? What will we lose as we embrace the technology? But as we think about that, I think we have to be open-minded because some of our bias about the in-person part of it comes from our own socialization, our own biases about what we like to do. Patients don't really care about what we like to do. We need to get over that part pretty quickly.
Thank you again. Unfortunately, we're running just short on time here. We might be here about the last question. You touched on this, and ideally, I think the point will come to where technology will decrease some of the inequities that we see in healthcare. But for the short term, with this increasing reliance on technology and for-profit tech company innovation, how are they going to address this? That some of these non-boutique hospitals getting left behind?
Yeah, I think it's another spectacular question. So the question is the issue of equity and inequities. I think the good news, there are several pieces of good news. First is this transformation is happening in an era where equity is front of mind. And so whether they really believe it in their heart of hearts or they're just saying it, if you are a tech company doing healthcare, you know, on the front page of your website, it is how you're going to be dealing with issues of equity and you know, people who don't have health insurance and people who live in rural areas. And you're often saying something like, there are ways that you can envision the new tech, which scales better than what we do, actually improving equity by making certain kinds of care accessible to people who otherwise had trouble accessing it. Now, that's too easy an answer because there will clearly be areas where, you know, in order to access this magical digital care, you need wireless and you need a computer. And if you don't have it, you're sort of out of luck. Now, that may turn out to not be a terrible thing if what happens to the healthcare system is that same patient who's trying to get in to see you in GI practice can't get in because it's a 2-month waiting list. And now there's a fair amount of what you used to do and why there's a 2-month wait that you are doing digitally for other patients with health insurance, let's say, and that opens up some bandwidth in the system for other patients. That's, you know, that may be an overly rosy way of looking at it. But I think the answer is, I think we have to have almost equipoise about this. There are easily ways that the technological revolution could cause inequities to grow. There are just as easily ways to look at this and say, I can see ways that will make it better, that will provide better access and cheaper access to more people who don't have access, good access to healthcare now. It has to be designed in from the beginning. And the tradition of American business, there was a great article 20 or 30 years ago talking about sort of how American healthcare works. And the first line was, America has this remarkable tradition of entrepreneurialism and egalitarianism. And I think that's actually quite smart. What it says is all of these companies, of course, are going to build tools that sell to people with money because they're in business and they've got to pay, you know, they've got to have a business case. Once they build it, one of the unique things about technology is its ability to scale. So the reason, you know, Facebook or Google or whatever, you build the tool, maybe you built it for people that had fancy computers in the beginning, but over time, once you build it, making 1 billion copies of it is essentially free. So the ability to build something maybe for people of means in the beginning, but then scale it broadly to people and make it less expensive is better in digital than it is in analog. So that's why I'm fairly hopeful about this, but of course we'll have to see. And there clearly are ways that this could make things worse if we're not very, very careful about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for your answer there and for joining us here today. I want to big thank you to the Healthcare Innovation Lab as well for bringing you here. And thank you for everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thanks so much.